Welcome to everyone. Welcome to Psychosocial Wednesdays. We have been having a complicated few months. I'm glad to see you here, and I know that tonight is going to go beautifully. I'm extremely pleased to be welcoming Robin McCoy Brooks. She's a Jungian analyst, educator, and consultant in Seattle and Bellingham up in Washington State in the USA. She is co-editor-in-chief of the IJJS, the International Journal of Jungian Studies, and she's also on the board of directors of the IAJS. Of her other credits, a number of organizations and a number of positions: founding member of the New School for Analytical Psychology, active analyst member of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. You know how remarkable the interregionals are. I don't know if everybody knows that, but they will be the people who are training in between areas where there are large organizations. It's quite a complicated but a very lively sort of network. And the International Association, or the IAAP, of course. She is also recently the author of Psychoanalysis, Catastrophe, and Social Action, which was a book with Routledge, 2022. It's still 2022, right? So this year. And she's also done a number of other presentations and publications. I'm really pleased to introduce Robin. Robin, would you like to begin?
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Bernard and Stefano. I really appreciate being invited in this unique event organized group, international group. And I had fun chatting with you prior. All right, hello everyone. Are you ready?
Yes.
Yeah. My fierce love, I will cry, for Lucas dragged me backwards into the hedges of AIDS, opening me to the world's wound through my own. He was standing on the other side of the river, beckoning me through his magnetism, his tragedy, and love. At some point, it was no longer enough to yell at each other across the turbulence. I had to join him on the other shore so that we could be at both shores at once. The metaphysics of being on both shores at once leads me to the work of Gloria Anzaldúa. Anzaldúa was an author, poet, philosopher, queer feminist of color who explored the aesthetics of knowledge production as they are shaped by identity transformation, healing, and social justice. She named the space in between Nepantla, adopted from Nahuatl, the Aztec language from which she claimed indigenous ancestry as a sixth-generation Mexicanos from the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. This concept is introduced in Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza, a groundbreaking text for the feminist post-colonial culture. Anzaldúa powerfully describes her experience of border culture this way. The US-Mexican border, it is a wound where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. And before a scab forms, it hemorrhages again, the lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third, a border culture. Radical personal and collective transformation is only possible, she claimed, by grappling the opposing perspectives that grate against each other in between the borderlands. These opposing concrete and psychical realities arise at the intersection of different geographies, cultures, ideologies, ethnicities, bodies, abilities, social class, belief systems, sexualities, gender, and language, to name only a few. On the transformational possibilities of bearing the tensions in Nepantla space, she elaborated, at some point on our way to new consciousness, we will have to leave the opposite between two mortal combatants, somehow healed, so that we are on both shores at once and at once see through serpent and eagle eyes. I love that part. See through serpent and eagle eyes. Or perhaps we decide to disengage from the dominant culture, write it off altogether as a lost cause, and cross the border into a wholly new separate territory. Or we might go another route. The possibilities are numerous, she said, once we decide to act and not react. Seeing through serpent and eagle eyes is a metaphor for newly acquired knowledge, what Anzaldúa calls mestiza consciousness. Third eye vision transcends the fundamental split within the human experience that needs to be healed, the division between our animal bodies and inspirited knowledge. Nepantla space is therefore a transitional opportunity to heal our internal psychical fragmentations by acquiring a more inclusive vision of reality that translates particularity into some kind of universality. Third eye vision levels distinctions between others by recognizing what is common amongst ourselves as peoples over time, while at the same time does not disallow what remains irreparably separate. Mestiza consciousness becomes for Anzaldúa an epistemology and ethics that informs how one thinks and acts from a more holistic perspective that is inclusive rather than siloed or homogeneous. Inspired by Anzaldúa's imaginary, I believe that we can work together towards transformative change in analytical psychology by creating new conceptual work and life knowledge systems that meet the collective needs of our time. To this end, I argue that we need to embrace a new vision for psychoanalysis of the people where social justice is a core value. While North American psychoanalysis and depth psychology informed practices have begun to incorporate multiculturalism into our discourse, there remains considerable concern about how we can actually integrate the lived experience of those who are on the margins within our profession and our communities at large. We are challenged to seriously engage critiques that identify how psychoanalysis is infantilistic, decontextualizing, apolitical, universalizing, individually focused, and reinforcing systems, systemic oppressive systems that we seek to eradicate. Embracing social justice as a core value within our discipline requires generating many forms of systemic change within our own house. With Lucas and others, I learned over 30 years ago that communities of care can be formed through grassroots coalition building practices, developing tools to deal with our multiplicity and its messiness, resisting taking an apologist stance, opening new valences of recognizing ourselves in another and noticing when we cannot. My body in relation to yours, orienting ourselves and how we do or do not relate, observing who is invited and who is refused at the door, limiting ways that divide us and noticing what unites us, building solidarity from a shared vision, theorizing with an open heart from eagle and serpent eyes, listening to those who are not influential, sharing influence and power, being curious about the material existence of others, bearing the heat of our ignorance with dignity. I begin by orienting my discussion around key aspects of Anzaldúa's corpus, through which I sketch a form of liberatory activism whose expansive vision we may conceptually consider at all levels of our profession, within our organizations, training institutions, the academy, conferences, patients, and so on. I illustrate this discussion with the narrative of Lucas Harris, who was a liberatory gay rights AIDS activist. Additionally, I braid in aspects of liberation psychology and Latinx feminist decolonizing philosophy, whose time has already come. Lucas was a spiritual activist, a nepantredas, one who facilitates passages between worlds. He could see through the arbitrary nature of social categories and still take a stand, reject while accepting, exclude while including, live while dying. His laser wit could focus on the most benign aspect of life that simultaneously unearthed a painful truth. For example, it was in the early 90s that I called him out of desperation because something alive was clawing up through my throat. We lived 3 hours away from each other. He was selling his worldly possessions in a garage sale, getting ready to die. His body was wasting with AIDS. I was standing beside my underwear drawer, putting laundry away when he picked up the phone. I remember the lighting in the room in the way that we do when time stops. Suddenly, I blurted, "Lucas, am I selling out? Am I selling out?" "Yes," he simply said. In that moment, I was floating across the divide towards him in my shame, his hands reaching out so that he could catch me and soften my landing on the other side, the other shore beside him, and them deep in the ravaging realities of AIDS, invisible to a broader socio-political world that erased evidence of their suffering. He could see that I was spiritually dying in my uncritically held corpulent lifestyle in Seattle. He picked at that scab, having stayed at our home a number of times, enjoying its comforts and mocking them. The Christmas before he died, he gave my young son an obscene child-sized electric car. He used his partner's credit card. They laughed for hours driving that thing around a cold and rainy schoolyard, often resting his wasting body on the railings and benches, hacking away like a smoker. Soon afterwards, my family and I moved to Portland in a whoosh of a baby's birth. Into the open wound of the world's shadow I fell, joining the others who were there all along. Anzaldúa, posits that at any moment something, one's health, external event, or memory, pulls us from habitual grounding and throws us into a free fall, opening us to our depths and radically shifting our perceptions. She named the ability to see what was before hidden, la facultà. La facultà, she stated, is the capacity to see in the surface phenomenon the meaning of deeper realities, to see the deep structures below the surface. This part of the psyche, she furthered, is animated by images and symbols that are the faces of feelings behind which feelings reside. La facultà opens one to excruciating aliveness, more accessible for those who are pushed out of the tribe, quote, for being different, therefore becoming more sensitized when not brutalized into insensitivity, end of quote. And then she says again, those who are pounced on the most have it the strongest, the females, the homosexuals of all races, the dark skinned, the outcast, the persecuted, the marginalized, the foreign. Anzaldúa described the biases in westernized Chicana culture that sought to invisibilize psyche's spiritual experience. She stated, like many Indians and Mexicans, I did not deem my psychic experience real. I denied their occurrences and let my inner senses atrophy I allowed white rationality to tell me that the existence of the other world was mere pagan superstition. Not only was the brain split into two functions, but so was reality. Thus, people inhabit both realities and are forced to split between body and the spirit and totally ignore the soul, to kill off parts of ourselves. Healing from soul loss for Anzaldúa required developing self-knowledge building practices that were relational, social, and attuned to a cultural ancestral heritage and personal authenticity. Her personal method was a self-writing practice that she named autohistoria theorea. Autohistoria theorea was a genre of writing that blended personal and cultural biography. A key insight into her creative process behind how her writing came into being can be gained by examining how she formed and reformed new stories of healing that were carefully attuned to self and collective identity. This process was acquired by assessing ancestral, historical references, memoir, cultural myth, imaginal elaboration, metaphor, and poetry, and the linguistic movement between English, Castilian, Spanish to North American dialect as Tex-Mex and occasionally Nahuatl, and unfold into an unfolding new language reflecting border culture. Anzaldúa described how male-dominated church, state, and culture diminished the sacredness of three spiritual feminine Chicano-Mexicanos icons, Guadalupe, La Malinche, and La Llorona, thereby cutting the people off from their deep ancestral roots and driving powerful female deities underground. She drew on the Aztec mythical figure of Coyozawe, goddess of the moon, to develop her personal and self-healing process, compelled by a desire to move from psychical fragmentation into a form of wholeness. Beginning when she was 3 years old, the image of Coatlicue entered her psyche. Coatlicue was the Aztec mountain earth goddess of birth and death. She presents herself at the threshold of underworld journeys as a prelude to potential transformative crossings. She symbolizes the synergistic fusion of all the opposites: horror and beauty, life and death, ego and the serpent. Anzaldúa claimed that she subverted cultural genocide by engaging these spiritual entities that arose through the gash of her wounded psyche. Her writing was a form of social activism because she de-invisibilizes herself through it as a self-healing practice that is shared. She bleeds all over the pages, pulling the reader into somatic attunement. We can see how writers of autohistoria powerfully critique what is missing from the dominating discourse. By speaking from a raw, authentic voice in her writing, she radically broke from what feminist Nadine Neighbor refers to as the academic industrial complex, a pervasive structure that determines how and what kinds of knowledge may be produced within a power matrix that erases other ways of knowing. Put another way, Latina feminist philosopher Elena Flores Ruiz summarizes how Anzaldúa's very act of self-narrativizing challenges the epistemic imperialism that oppresses her by drawing on her corporeal intuitions of subaltern knowledges that are social and relational form, the multiple interpretive and transhistorical traditions she inhabits. Perhaps Jung and Anzaldúa. Perhaps you've recognized similarities between Jung and Anzaldúa in this crowd. I hope so. They're distinct cosmological onto-epistemologies. Anzaldúa directly acknowledged how Jungian thought influenced her work in addition to many diverse sources, including art, film, transhistorical indigenous knowledge, socio-political cultural context, feminism, and transpersonal psychology. Her indebtedness to Jungian psychology is noted in multiple cited references to archetypes of the unconscious, mythology, shadow, collective unconscious, active imagination, imaginal psychology, dream work, and reimagining Jung's notion of the transcendent function with Nepenthe. Her master's thesis focused on an archetypal approach to literature using Jungian psychology. James Hillman is referred to at least in 3 texts: Revisioning Psychology, Healing Fiction, and The Dream and the Underworld. Both Jung and Anzaldúa developed self-explorative methods narrativizing symbolic thinking and mytho-creative imagination. Jung's self-exploration, chronicled in the Black Books and Red Books Liber Novus, began when he actively engaged the inner voices, hallucinatory episodes, waking visions, and dreams he received in the period from 1913 to 1932 that became the nucleus of his later works. The process he surrendered to required that he overcome conventional boundaries between psychology, visionary literature, visual arts, esoteric practices, and what would represent, in his own words, the most difficult experiment of my life in service of the soul. End of quote. Anzaldúa's relational form of writing, autohistoria, was a self-reflective process whose aim was to heal the spiritual psychical split within herself through social justice work. Her writing intersects the geopolitical historic colonizations, multiple, of Mexico and psychosocial oppression of the female Chicana queer psyche she seeks to heal throughout her work. She describes historic layers of misogyny as, man's nightmarish pieces. Women, she describes, are at the bottom, this is a quote, at the bottom of the class ladder, one rung above the deviants, i.e. homosexuals and physically and mentally disabled people, valuing the welfare of the tribe above that of the individual, end of quote. Her notion of shadow beast is a split off part of the psyche that revolts in various forms of violent and soul crushing oppressions she awakens to. Anzaldúa does not separate the personal shadow from the collective ancestral forces that grind against each other in a psychical maelstrom. Her revisioning of soul can be understood through the psychosocial, historic, cultural heritage and the socio-political dimensions of the public sphere. The collective shadow and the effects of real world events manifest uniquely in the body. She says, once they are acknowledged, she claims, we enter into a healing process that breaks down the unitary aspect of newly arising paradigm. This process is excruciatingly painful, but mobilized by the ongoing creative energies of a protean self that pushes against our social sickness, she says, with new tools and practices whose goal is to effect a shift, end of quote, by acting as a bridge between political activism and spiritual activism. While Jung envisioned individual healing may lead to social transformation, I often think of him as a psychosocial luminary, along with Lacan. He did not consider social justice to be an immediate agenda. Individuation, he wrote, was a process by which individual beings are formed and differentiated, in particular in the development of the psychological individual as being distinct from the general collective psychology. We do not find in Jung a methodological means through which a self is motivated to become collectively innovative or part of a social reform within our discipline, our analytical practice, or the world at large. How does Anzaldúa's notion of self-agency actually lead to social change? Latinx philosopher Andrea Pitts reads Anzaldúa's framing of the multiplicitous agency and coalition building to neither laud the false unification of all disparate political movements, nor advocate for the erasure of differences. Rather, citing Anzaldúa from an earlier work, La Prieta, such an agency is a path of a two-way movement, a going deep into the self and expanding out into the world, a simultaneous recreation of the self and a reconstruction of society. The Delft movement between self and social change does not exclusively require a shared collective identity. Anzaldúa's vision incorporates personal work and dialectical engagement in the public sphere, where coalitional spaces of oppressed peoples and allies may retain differences in positions, history, experiences through sharing and discourse. Further, the unifying ethos of such a diversified collective was a shared vision of ending multiple oppressions within the coexistence of shared concerns. Knowledge in this view is socially embedded. Knowing myself is a collective undertaking. I met Lucas after he was diagnosed with AIDS. He was a participant in my friend Lucia Marx's dissertation study in the mid-'80s. During one of the many psychodrama AIDS retreats that we led, Lucas and Lucia each dreamed that they would build an AIDS healing center together. The basic elements of each of their dreams were the same, but they had been living on radically different shores until AIDS brought them together. Lucia was a middle-aged mother of 4, living in a mansion with 12 couches, 25 exotic handmade rugs, no kidding, 5 cars, situated on a tree-lined avenue with no street parking. Her husband was a heart surgeon. Lucas was a young gay man who had given blowjobs on the street corners for cash, eventually becoming a hairstylist. Lucia was now a clinical psychologist, and Lucas had not graduated from high school. Joining each other in their shared vision required a fierce and painful commitment to something that would transcend their singular identity markers and class positions. Each opened to the terrifying depths of their calling and surrendered to it. Lucia would eventually walk away from her marriage, her home, the lifestyle, to participate wholeheartedly in the forming of an AIDS community in Portland, Oregon. Lucas would dedicate his remaining short life to what would become Project Quest, a nonprofit AIDS clinic in 1989, with Lucia and many others. Lucia and Lucas's dreams emerged within a coalitional space of an AIDS psychodrama retreat. Psychodrama is a process where a protagonist elects to go into the center of the room, and the psychodrama director follows their emerging narrative by concretizing their story. This process is facilitated when the protagonist selects participants in the room to enact and amplify the narrative's unfolding purpose. Linda, not her real name, Linda's drama focused on her fear of dying, given that she was a breast cancer survivor, having experienced horrific prolonged medical treatment with poor diagnosis. The omnipresent viscerality of illness and terror of dying penetrated the room through this drama. Many of the participants in these retreats were in various stages of illness and dying. The smell of disease hung in the air like raw sewage, flatulence, vomit, old sweat, alongside of roasting turkey and brewing coffee. Linda's psychodrama opened a space for others to describe the concrete and surreal symptoms of their singular body's decline, relentless despair and terror about what was ahead, concerns about a lack of viable treatment or the horrific effects of the early treatments such as AZT, fear about terrible social alienation, rejection, dying alone, financial instability. Who will care for me, love me, fuck me now? Lucia and Lucas's parallel dream emerged in a Nepantla space within a personal, group, and global crisis in the night following Linda's psychodrama. Further, this shared dream was not Lucia's or Lucas's alone, or nothing would have come of it. Others who were experiencing pain, illness, existential and corporeal threat also desired a space in which they could collaboratively share resources and accompany each other in an otherwise alienating world. From this vignette, we can now better understand how coalitional agency becomes possible from grassroots when the unifying ethos of a diversified group generates a shared vision through the lived coexistence of shared concerns towards social transformation. Elsewhere, I have described in my book how the emergence of Quest was akin to what is referred to today as a mutual aid community in social activist circles. If you don't have this book and you're remotely interested in this concept, get it. It's very thin. You can read it in a night, and it tells you how to lead a group that's humane and empowering. Mutual aid communities are participatory in that they are collective, and that they collectively solve problems by creating cultures that mobilize community members towards shared aims through shared leadership and responsibility amongst a diverse membership. We were a hybrid mutual aid and mental health community. We figured this out 25 years later. We found the language for it, whose collective aim was creating a healing community and clinic within socio-political erasure. Now, it must be said that Quest was not an anomaly. It arose within a broader zeitgeist of AIDS activism, as these things do and can, around the US and abroad. From its inception, AIDS activism arose from many grassroots sites, focusing on the importance of empowering people living with HIV disease. Empowerment was supporting each other in making treatment decisions, creating networks to share fast developing medical information and medications, and advocating for improvements in the FDA approval processes, and challenging the top-down doctor-patient paradigm, to name only a few. As therapists, Graham Harriman, Lucia, and I often found that our methods and theories fell short of meeting the compelling and radically diverse needs of community members. For example, there were unique experiences of illness, varying psychical and emotional abilities, limited or prior exposure to dying and death, especially on a collective level, differences in socioeconomic status, race, education, cultural practices. We did not have a template on how to engage collective plague trauma. There was no manual. There is no manual today either. We adapted what we call a heuristic approach to group community work that emerged from a shared ethos of inclusivity and generosity as a result of our psychodrama training. The heuristic approach we found was remarkably similar to how social activist Dean Spade, back to this book, describes processes within each mutual aid community. A heuristic approach problem solves through practice and experience rather than working exclusively with an already formulated theory in collaboration with other group leaders and members, but always following the emerging needs of the group. Social change of this nature is slow, moving, and arduous process pockmarked by aggravating stasis, disappointing reversals, immutable grief, accelerations of pace, eruptive forms of humor, terrifying turbulences, contradictions, flow, deep love, and transformative breaking through. Thus far, I've used my experiences from 30 years ago with the Quest community to amplify several of Anzaldúa's notions that I believe are relevant for our consideration today if we are to really embrace inclusionary social justice within our discipline. Simultaneously, these are notes on decolonizing psychoanalysis. They are notes, they are not complete thoughts. We need each other to do this. Simultaneously to the formation of Project Quest in 1989, amidst the spiritus mundi of Western HIV/AIDS activism and the publications of Anzaldúa's first two books, was the quickening of the liberation psychology movement in Latin America. I will formulate my final thoughts through a cursory review of the intersection between liberatory and decolonizing epistemologies, with a keen eye towards how we may be inspired to radicalize depth psychology. This is a whirlwind tour. See Mary Watson for more in-depth. But I have to do it because many people might not even be aware of what it is. We don't need to recreate the wheel. We can just work with it. Liberation epistemology was born from the recognition of repressed peoples in general, but emerged originally in Latin America. Peruvian priest Gustavo Gutierrez, generally considered to be the father of liberation theology, produced a seminal text entitled A Theology of Liberation in 1971. His theoretical and ethical focus on the psychosocial conditions of the poor launched a field of study and practice that integrated Latin American liberation psychology in the Catholic Church in the 50s and 60s, devoted to social justice on behalf of the most oppressed. The central tenets outside of the Catholic Church have today inspired the emergence of Black, Jewish, Islamic, feminist liberation theologies today. Greatly influenced by Gutierrez, Brazilian pedagogist Paulo Freire would famously develop the notion of his notion of consciousness, which I tried and practiced. I cannot say in Spanish. Consciousness was not a passive process, but the struggle to become fully human amidst systemic disempowering relations, social political transactions, and ideological conditions that coalesce with self-identity. Inspired by the tenets of liberation theology, including Freire's conception of consciousness, Ignacio Martín Bedo, a Spanish-born Jesuit priest who I hope some of you know of, and social psychologist working in El Salvador in the 70s and 80s, would become the founder of what is known as liberation psychology today. Liberation psychology identified the deleterious effects of oppression on personhood and collective life, and the need for psychology to embrace social justice as a central aim. Simultaneously, the work of Martinique-born psychiatrist Frantz Fanon would influence both Freire and Martin Bedeau. Fanon delineated the psychopathology of colonization and highlighted the importance of decolonization for the liberating of oppressed people, especially throughout the African diaspora, within the cross-pollination of experience and ideas of Martin Barrow, would agree that psychology needed to rehabilitate into psychology of liberation by challenging psychologists to take a stand on social justice in order to create a more humane society. And he introduced the term psychosocial trauma. In the 80s, he was murdered in 89, I believe. By developing the work of critical awareness of one's social political reality, he sought to de-idealize oppressive narratives by empowering individuals to narrate their own identity. Moving to today, Maori activist and academic Linda Tuhiwai Smith highlighted in her influential work entitled Decolonizing Methods, how the question of knowledge in the context of decolonization of methods was crucial. She argued that knowledge institutions needed to examine and critique the roles that knowledge production, and knowledge hierarchies play in social transformation. Tuhiwai Smith introduces us to decoloniality movement embraced by philosophers, cultural theorists, anthropologists, social scientists, activists, psychologists, and feminists radicalized by dehumanizing physical and psychical effects of colonization. Decoloniality is a way to habilitate knowledge that has been subjugated by the forces of modernity, settler colonism, and racial capitalism. Now we're going to pivot to some exciting developments in the area of depth psychology that have roots in liberation and decolonizing epistemology. I have three I want to mention today that I will, to soften our landing on the other shore. I found a beautiful paper, 2020. If anybody wants it, I will send it to you. It's on the psychology of radical healing for people of color and indigenous individuals that has been developed in the US and reaches beyond individual approaches to cope with racial oppression. The framework builds on social justice, education, and activism as forms of healing transformation that integrates elements of liberation psychology, Black psychology, ethnopolitical psychology, and intersectionality theory. It's a powerful paper in summary. And some of you, if you don't know this book and you teach it, the history of this is From Freud to Liberation Psychology, 2019, I think, a people's history of psychoanalysis by Daniel Jose Gastambide. And just came out, and you can find him in all the podcasts. He formulates a psychoanalytically informed theory of race, class, and oppression. His work attempts to integrate the central tenets of the relational school of psychoanalysis, particularly Jessica Benjamin, into a broader liberatory theoretical vision for a psychoanalysis of the people. It's a very brief introduction. And I'll say a little bit more about Mary Watson, who will be presenting in this forum and later in the IAJS seminars. She can't present enough, and this is her latest book, Mutual Accompaniment and the Creation of the Commons. She's written a number of books, but I'm going to speak a little bit about her because we're not alone. We don't have to recreate the wheel. Mary Watson is a leading voice in liberation psychology for many decades. She is a co-founder of in Pacifica of the Community Liberation, Indigenous, and Eco-Psychology's graduate specialization at Pacifica Graduate Institution. Her works powerfully critique psychology and psychoanalysis and the oppressive systemic processes at large while offering liberatory alternatives in the ways we might consider embracing. I do not immediately feel the knife of my own ignorance penetrate my solar plexus because of the skill in which she challenges, educates, illustrates, and offers possibilities. Saturated now, moving to my closing, by these perspectives, we can ask ourselves, is analytical psychology and psychoanalysis in general too white, too homogenized, too alien, too wealthy to be relevant in the modern world? My answer is yes. I have a few suggestions that I've culled from the resources engaged in this essay. 1, we must examine and amend the ways in which our theories and practices overly rely on North American and Western European psychoanalytic theories that define healing from a universal frame that is individualistically focused. We must advance beyond individual level approaches alone and create new frameworks as we face shared collective catastrophes that are uniquely experienced. This includes learning from other psychological frameworks of healing from diverse communities rooted in social justice around the world in our own communities. It also means developing psychosocial theories and practices that integrate elements of liberatory and decolonizing philosophies from the grassroots. 2, we must identify how our discipline contributes to material and economic inequality and eliminate our exploitive practices within our discipline, we must ask ourselves the following questions. How can we make a renewed, inclusive analytic training more accessible? Who cannot afford analytic training, and why do we favor those who can? The same question can be applied towards professional training. Who can afford to attend international conference, or any conference for that matter, and educational opportunities? Who sits on our boards, professional boards, our professional organizations? Whose voices dominate the listservs, our platforms of power? Who is left out? Is power being shared or hoarded? And lastly, 3, we must self-reflect on how we are complicit in social injustice in our discipline, and take responsibility. While we may be aware of the brutal history of white European American colonialism and racism, psychoanalysis in general today does not adequately acknowledge or take responsibility for historical or present harms to others we are perpetuating. Nor do we view enough. Sometimes a little here and there, we don't do it enough, nor do we view oppression. This is Mary Watson's comment in a personal conversation. Nor do we view oppression as part of the work of individuation or healing for ourselves or our patients. We can ask ourselves, how have I colluded with the systems that oppress, exploit, and loot marginalized others by virtue of the effects of my uncritically held power, including the generations before me? Is my practice accessible to all bodies? Are my rates affordable? Do I collaborate with others who have other kinds of knowledge? Do I work heuristically in my professional endeavors? Am I interested in sharing power with others, including those who have less power but retain knowledge I do not have? Have I sold out again? Answering hurts. Joining others through such a shared vision opens us to what Freire referred to as a conversion experience that requires a profound rebirth. I write this essay humble, yet I'm also inspired by the dead and the living on whose shoulders I stand as I reach out to you across the Napantla wound I believe we share. The possibilities are numerous, Anzaldúa said, once we decide to act and not react. Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely, passionate speech, quite wonderful. If people would like to put comments or questions, please put them in the chat box. So, sorry, Bernhard, were you thinking of saying something?
No.
Oh, okay. I'll just perhaps start with a simple, I suppose we had some of this discussion online. There's such I'm thinking about your experience with the AIDS groups, which were also, of course, AIDS theater groups. So there's something very much in the body, in presence, and also in connection in multiple people, right? We're also aware of the smells of the ill bodies, but that aspect of presence is, one of about 20,000 things that are going on in this dense field. So I do understand the cultural critique of being too isolated, being different from that. But then there's also the entire question of illness and death and the fact that they can be themselves isolating, right? I'm not just saying because of modern hospitals. There's that difficulty of going away, I don't know. I realize it's not the same in every culture. So would you say these things are connected, or am I drawing too distant?
Yeah, what I'm drawing on is that it was through how the group coalesced and became a progressive coalition,
of course,
multiplicitous coalition, let me know that that can happen. Now, there are unique conditions that, so I'm making so that when I read Anzaldúa and others,
Yes.
and my book is filled with examples of that, but Anzaldúa is not in that. She's in the next one. There are all kinds of language fits for describing what can happen as with coalitional agency when it comes together, whether it's AIDS or that's COVID, or whatever, a classroom, a therapy group, a training seminar, our how we train our analysts.
No, I see that. I see that.
Yeah. Does that help?
That's clearer to me than the paths I've been thinking along. So sort of the possibility of that commonality, communality, connection, and the way it would transform the environment. Other questions? Nomi has mentioned, pardon me, she's done it in several things that I've slightly lost track of. She wanted to mention James Whitney, who was a Jungian who did a lot in social justice. So did that in the 1920s. Yeah. And Susan Rowland has mentioned Mary Watkins.
Yes, Watson. Yeah.
Ah, okay. Watson or Watkins? Susan, which is it? No, not seeing it. Okay. I don't know if they're different people, but it may be Mary Watson, who I believe is actually speaking on our series this year, by the way. So
you need to let her speak. She was, her mic was on.
Ah, sorry. Where am I? Oh, yeah. Susan Rowland is saying it's Mary Watkins. Are we talking about different people? Tell you
Watkins, sorry. Watkins.
Oh, yeah. Yes, sorry.
It's Watkins.
It is.
Thank you.
It is Watkins.
Yeah.
No, I completely get it. I've certainly done the same thing myself. So we're talking about Mary Watkins. Yes, familiar. Okay. Who else has something to say on the topics of today? An oddly quiet room. I apologize for that, but it was a brilliant presentation with a lot of life to it. Thank you. I think perhaps everyone's absorbing it. So what would you want us to do now, not just in the long run? That can be a want, not a reasonable ask, but something that you would want, even if it's beyond the reasonable.
Well, to consider the wisdom of other peoples and to really ask ourselves, are we doing the best job we can in analytical psychology and how we train, teach? What's going on in the South America? What's happening there? What's happening in Taiwan and China? I mean, are we listening as much to other voices other than our own? I say our here. Sure. Yours and mine, Paul. I know we're not. I was inspired to write this for some evidences, and I want to learn.
Okay.
From others.
Oh, sorry. I'm probably jumping too quickly today. Riz Swank asks, that image of the border as a wound was so vivid. Is there a similar wound you see in Jungian studies in particular?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Sorry, and given my musical background, I'm of course thinking of the whole Parsifal productions, but excuse me, go ahead, yes.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned them in my 3 comments. I think we're unaffordable to many people. We've received an email, 80% of the people speaking in Argentina are white. And many people can't afford to go, and they live in South America because of the rates. That's an example of the wound.
Mm-hmm.
It was a good idea to have a Congress there, but how do we make it possible? I don't want to go there and hear my own voice.
Sure.
I will be, but I also want to, I go there to, we went to Cape Town. There's a Cape IAJS conference there.
Yes.
I was so inspiring. You know, there were many voices, and I think we have to really put our heads together and figure out how to do this. I can't do it alone, but we have our but the grassroots part, that's from our own little spheres of influence, we can slowly begin now. We don't need to become paralyzed.
Yes. Becoming paralyzed is a problem here, as you know. Mm-hmm. The size of everything. But yeah, mm-hmm. No. Lynn Franco says, what about resistances to change in our training programs? How have you encountered working with them? Without perhaps too many specifics.
Do we have, how much time do we have? 30 seconds.
As much as you like.
No, there's a lot of resistance. I mean, it's hard to change. I think that's a really important comment. But how does change happen? We have to be moved to do it. It's an inside job. It comes from the body, where we can't stand how we are anymore or what's happening. And then we're willing to make sacrifices with and amongst others who are willing, without knowing exactly how, but working. That's what working heuristically means. It's like kind of from the seat of the pants. When we teach, we do that.
Yes.
Those are the amazing and terrifying moments. What the fuck moments.
I have 3 comments that are coming from what you were just saying. Angie Brenner said, as a candidate in Jungian training, I am very moved by your talk, and it overlaps with so many of my questions about whether I am selling out in this kind of training, how to be an influence for pushing my training to be more inclusive.
Oh, yes.
You see the difficulty. You've probably seen it before, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Susanna Rupsat says, perhaps agency work. I work at a counseling center for immigrants and refugees. Very intense. I know a lot of people have done things like this lately, of course. And then Hallie Derkschlag said, it seems as though we have 2 layers to sort, both the homogeneity of the analysts and the homogeneity of those who can afford it. Where does change begin? Mm-hmm. What would you do with that? Or is that hard to know?
Again, the dialectic, the talking amongst ourselves, coming up. I alone struggle with my own, how ethics about how to do this, but it together. I do believe in the collective agentic possibilities of the group. I believe in it. I've seen it happen. And with certain, at the group that with a certain ethos that Spade talks about, the possibility for us thinking into new areas can really happen. I believe it. I hope in my lifetime that it'll be noticeable, but we can begin now where we live, in our classrooms, in our offices, even though it's a screen, in the way we teach, or students, or act on boards. I love my board, the IAJS, not my board, the IAJS board. The only reason I stay on it is because it attempts to adapt this ethos. We were talking about that before we began.
Sure. Dennis Merritt does have a question. I'll do it live.
Okay, and not so much a question, but a way of framing this in kind of a broader perspective. I've been very involved with young environmental issues.
Yeah.
And it seems pretty clear to me that if we keep going in the direction we are in so many different ways, that it's going to be an absolute disaster for not only our species, but probably 20–30% of the other species on the planet. And it seems the only way that we have some hope is that as a species, we start working together with this common cause of living sustainably and reconnecting with the environment. And I'm thinking that that sense of a commonality and a community with the environment is something that could be extended to social issues. And what you are talking about would be one of those dimensions. But if we don't start with a sense of our community with the environment and the rest of nature, I think we are sunk.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? By the way, Altaf Bhimji has said, thank you for an amazing talk. Ruth Klassen, I'm part of a small Jung society here in Dallas. Our contribution is to put on one program of our 7 per year devoted to race. That's powerful. That's interesting. Is there anything you want to close with, Robin? Thank you for an amazing talk.
Well, I thank you for coming. I mean, thank you for coming and listening to hard stuff. Anzaldúa is hard to read and easy to read. Just seeing yourself is hard. AIDS was really hard. And saving our world is hard. And becoming human beings in the way we practice is going to be really hard. We're going to have to give we're going to have to give shit up. We're going to have to give stuff up, just as human beings, but also to save it. What you were saying, Dennis, it all fits together. So I want to say thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to me. And I hope to hear what you have to say too. I am not the sound of one hand clapping. It's all about us getting together. So
thank you, Robin.
That's what all I have to say. Thank you.
Really wonderful, really smart, and really passionate. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Robin.
We'll see you in a month with, I apologize, Bernhard, do you remember who our next speaker is? Because I did not put it in my head.
Wait a minute.
Ann Casement.
Thank you very much. And Casement in a month. So thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you so much, Robin.
All right. Thank you, Paul.
Hope to see you all around. Take care.
Ciao.